Alright, and welcome to the final video for Chapter 7. In this video, we're going to be talking about why context is so important for memory. So, retrieval context matters. So, where we are, what we're doing, how we're feeling, these are all things that are important for our ability to access a memory. And that's because whenever we are learning something, when we are learning something that we need to memorize, we are not just learning that piece of information, we're also associating it to where we are when we're learning it, how we're feeling, what we're thinking about, what other things were presented before and after that information. These are all part of the retrieval context in that memory. And so, knowing that, the closer we get to that retrieval context, the easier it is to retrieve that information from our memory. The less similar we are to that retrieval context, the more difficult it gets to accessing that memory. This is true for lots of different contexts. It can be true for how you're feeling or the emotional context. It can be true for the semantic context, so how similar is that content to what you're supposed to be remembering. And it can be true for your environment. It can be true for where you physically are in space. We're going to look at a couple of examples of this. The first one that we're going to look at is called the encoding specificity principle. The encoding specificity principle is essentially it's essentially looking at how you encode something and how you retrieve something. And the closer those two are, the better you are at retrieving that information, the more fluid it becomes. So, if you encode a piece of information a specific way, then you can also retrieve it using that specific language. As an example, essentially, and we're going to be talking about this in a few different ways, but you have a test context and a study context. You're going to study up on some information, and then you're going to be tested on it later. I use those words because not only are they used like that in research, but also it's very easy to imagine how you can use this to study, how you can use this to do well on exams by putting it into that language. That basically, you want to try to get your study context and your test context as similar as possible. If you have them as similar as possible and those contexts are very similar, you're going to have an easier time accessing those long-term memories. That is the encoding specificity principle. So, one really important study in illustrating this is Godden and Baddeley. And Baddeley is the same Baddeley that we talked about last chapter when we were talking about working memory. And essentially what he and his colleague did is they tested people and their memory for different kinds of lists. And they did this with scuba divers. So they did this with people who were above water and people who were underwater. So here is the way that they did this. They had people either in one or two conditions. They were either on land whenever they learned this list, or they were underwater when they learned this list. And then, whenever they were tested on this, they were either tested again underwater, or they were tested again on land. So, we have these four different conditions then. And that's what you're looking at here in this figure. So, here on the x-axis, we are looking at if they studied on land, or if they studied underwater. And then the colors are referring to where they were tested on that information. Green means they were tested on land. Blue means that they were also tested underwater. And so you can easily see already who did best on this memory task. Well, people that studied on land and were tested on land. But also people who studied underwater and were tested underwater. People who studied on land and then were tested underwater did not perform very well, and people who studied underwater and were tested on land also did not do very well. So what this means is that essentially, just think about this in terms of the retrieval context. Think about kind of the study context being on land or underwater, and then think about the test context and how closely they match. The closer they match, the better we do at remembering this information. So I want you to use that information to think about how you can study for the next exam. Because what this suggests is basically that wherever you take your exams, that's also where you want to be studying. This is super important if you're taking a test online, right? You don't want to study in a Panera Bread and then take the exam at home because those contexts are very, very dissimilar. Instead, what you'd want to do is probably pick a spot in the house where that's going to be your cognitive psychology corner. That's where whenever you're with your laptop, you're learning about cognitive psychology, and then whenever you're done, watching these videos or doing these quizzes, then you move to a different part of the house and you move the computer to that part or whatever. That way, whenever you're taking the exam, you just go back to that corner and you take it there, and essentially what you've learned is all associated with that specific corner. So that way the test context and the study context are very similar. Very much like this example down here with learning on land and learning underwater. This is also true not just for geographic environments, but also for emotional environments. So this particular figure, and this is a little bit kind of hard to see what's going on here, but on the x-axis we have how someone was feeling whenever they were tested. So we see people who were feeling great and people who are feeling depressed, and we are looking at negative words, positive words, and neutral words. And it might actually be kind of hard to see on the YouTube video, but what we see is that for positive words, that people did really, really well in recalling positive words whenever they were feeling really good at the time of test. We see that people were really, really good at remembering negative words whenever they were feeling bad at the time of testing. And there wasn't really a huge difference for the neutral words between these two different types. But you can also see the reverse is true, that people did not really remember the happy words when they were depressed. Neither did they remember the depressing words, the negative words, whenever they were happy. And so, again, think about this in terms of context. How you are feeling matters. That's called this is called state-dependent learning. That essentially, what you are learning is how you're feeling and the words with it. And so whenever you are trying to retrieve that information, you're more likely to retrieve information that is associated with that mood state. The same way that you would associate things with a Panera Bread that you've been studying at, or a certain corner of your home. So state-dependent learning is essentially like it is easier to recall happy things whenever you are feeling happy. It is easier to remember crappy things whenever you are feeling crappy. That's part of the reason why depression is so bad, is because whenever you're depressed, all you can really remember are the other times that you were feeling similarly. Whereas if you're happy, it's much easier for you to remember other times in which you felt happy too. So, another way you can think about this, those of you that are of age of drinking, you've probably done this before, where whenever you are drunk, you're more likely to remember other things that happened whenever you were drunk. That's why if you've ever been drinking with friends, pretty much all that people talk about when they're drunk are other times that they were drunk, which is really annoying if you are a designated driver and you're sober. Essentially, you're more likely to remember drunk things whenever you are drunk than whenever you are sober. If you were to lose your keys while you were drinking and you sobered up, what this advice might be is maybe you should have a couple of drinks and try to get a little bit intoxicated again, and then try to find where your keys are. You're more likely to remember where you put them then. I'm not going to recommend that you do that. I think that's actually probably a bad idea, but that's kind of the lesson that state-dependent learning offers us. Another example would be like if you are studying for an exam while you are drunk, you should take the exam while you're drunk. And again, don't actually do this. I don't think that would be a good idea. But think, instead of using the phrase drunk, think about it while drinking coffee. So while drinking coffee, if that's how you study, is with coffee, then make sure you take the exam with some coffee as well. So how can we apply all these lessons from our chapter to the real world? I think that, basically what you want to do is try to match how you study with how you take the exam. So whenever you're taking our next exam, try to make it at the same time of day as you normally study this stuff, in the same location. And if you normally have coffee, make sure you have coffee. If you normally are wearing pajamas, wear pajamas. But if we're also, so we can take that, but we can also try to imagine using this stuff with what we learned at the very beginning of this chapter by using mnemonics and thinking about how we can turn these things that are really difficult for us to memorize, that are very detail oriented, how we can turn those into funny or interesting, vivid stories that are going to help us remember. Because, hey, I guarantee, or I don't guarantee, but I bet that you probably still remember those 7 items on that grocery list that we walked through. And if you don't remember, just close your eyes and remember pulling up to your childhood home and what you step into whenever you're leaving out of your car. So you can use all of these different tools to help you study. It does take some time to do, and it isn't always easy at first, but it does really, really work. All right, these are just the digits of pi in case you were doing the first 100 digits of pi. You can test your own knowledge. Again, check that out whenever you get there. That is it for this particular chapter. Next chapter, for chapter 8, we're going to be looking at remembering complex events, which generally means emotional events and also events that are not actually true. So how we create false memories and things like that. It's going to be a very interesting chapter, and I will see you there.